reflects a deep distrust in the electorate for politicians and for elites. And I think we've talked about that at previous Newcastle Institute events. And some of the people, many of the people who have supported Trump should not be sneered at. I mean, a lot of white working class people, for example, this is the only demographic in the OECD whose life expectancy is going down. There are people who feel vulnerable, who feel shut out of the system, and for whatever reason, they've decided that they'd take a punt on Trump. I just don't think it's a great punt to take. This is someone who's not ideologically consistent, and as I say, I don't think he's a conservative. Now, let me illustrate that. When I think of conservatism, I think of a respect for custom and for tradition and for institutions. I think of someone who believes in incremental rather than radical change, someone who probably supports free markets, someone who has a respect for, received wisdom and the expertise of elites, for want of a better way of putting it, who respects individualism, who's got a high regard for the Constitution, who believes in a strong national defence, and I suppose someone who believes in this notion of American exceptionalism. Now, I think Trump has walked over a lot of those values. I think he's a radical. I don't think he has much respect for tradition beyond serving his own interests, really. I think he's really done some damage to the country's institutions, notably the free press. I don't think he believes in consensual sort of change. I think he sees, as I've said, politics as a zero-sum game. He's a protectionist. He's a nationalist rather than an internationalist. He attacks some of the national security advisors in his own party. And he believes that America should retreat to the world rather than going out to the world and demonstrating global leadership. Now, some of the people in the audience tonight might not think that Americans should be out there leading from the front, and that's it's perfectly okay if that's the view. But that has been a hallmark of a very strong strain of conservatism in the United States. So I think Trump has upended conservatism, as I understand the term. He's redefined it in another way. He's basically a populist and an ethnic nationalist, and the Republican Party at the moment. And I don't think this is a good thing. I think this is something to mourn and something to bemoan, really, has been reduced to a kind of anti-political insurgency more than anything else. Culture war stuff.
Yeah. One of our members, Michael, has asked a question about, and it relates to the issue of Trump as a leader, about what qualities would you like to see in an American president who would be good for America and for our world? And maybe you might comment on whether Biden reflects those qualities.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not a time for ideologues and extremists. There are plenty of those around. And I'm certainly not here to advocate for Joe Biden, but I think I would be here to advocate for the value of pragmatism in politics and being prepared to speak and work across the aisle. I mean, we've never needed it more. Years ago, someone wrote that, what was one of the great things about the internet, it was going to democratize information. Well, it's certainly done that, but it hasn't democratized the quality of information. And we've now got politics where people speak past each other, they basically shout at each other, and politics is more about winning, and your opponent isn't just wrong, he or she is bad or evil. Yep. And you don't have to talk, and you don't have to build coalitions with people who are bad or who are evil. You have to destroy them. So what would I like? What sort of leadership do we need? I think we need non-ideological, pragmatic leadership that doesn't see politics as a zero-sum game, and that responds speedily and with as much diversity as possible to political problems as they arise.
In history, are there any leaders that have been like Trump?
Uh, well, he's quite unique. I mean, I suppose all leaders are unique in their own way because they're individuals. But in the United States, I can't think of many. One of the comparisons that you sort of see around in the media a bit is comparing Trump to people like Mussolini and Hitler. And I always say when you invoke Hitler, you sort of lose the argument because you're sort of cherry picking a bit there. You could say, well, Trump demonstrates racist behaviour. Hitler was a racist, therefore Trump's like Hitler. But you as a historian, I always think you're trying to build a complete picture, and there's more that separates Trump from a Hitler or a Mussolini than connects him with those people. So no, I think Trump is quite unique. As I think I said earlier, I think ego is the ideology. And this is someone, certainly in the context of 20th century and 21st century American politics, he's an outsider within his own party. Now, that's unusual. That's unusual. So I don't think there has been a president quite like Trump.
If we just talk domestically at the moment, US domestically, some of his promises domestically were around jobs growth, similar to the sorts of terms we hear here. And he claims that, he's had the biggest jobs growth ever. The economy's better than ever before. And this is now, and even before COVID. But they're looking at the data. The data suggests that the downward trend in unemployment was at the same rate with Obama, and it continued with Trump, so there was no change. And that in fact GDP dropped last year before COVID, and of course we know what the impact COVID's had on all economies. What's your sense of what he's delivered, whether he's delivered on his domestic promises from 2016?
I think he's delivered on some of them and not on others. Probably he's failed to deliver on most. And I think what COVID did was that it undermined what was going to be his key re-election platform, which is, the economy was moving in the right direction and unemployment was at record lows, and COVID has really destroyed that. And so what you've seen in response is the Trump campaign basically double back and say, okay, well, how are we going to play this? And so the message now coming out is from the Trump team on the economy is, well, let's restore the pre-COVID economy, and we're best placed to do that. So I think they're pushing very hard on that message in relation to the economy. And I think the other couple of big messages that Trump is running at the moment, and this reflects the politics of the last sort of 6 months, but also you could argue of the last few years, he's running hard on law and order, mainly in response to BLM protests or riots, depending on how you cut that. And he's running on well, if you elect the other guy, you're going to get the radical left. The radical left is actually controlling Biden. So I think they're the three big campaign sort of themes or slogans. I'd add one other, and all of this connects up in a way with your question, Robin. Trump plays the man very hard in politics rather than the ball sometimes. And there's this sort of ongoing kind of personal battle with Biden where Trump regularly resorts to a strategy, if that's the right word, of depicting his opponent as cognitively ill-equipped and basically too old to be president. And because he set the benchmark so low for Biden, if Biden just comes out and talks in a way that you can broadly understand, he's exceeding expectations. So it wasn't particularly smart strategy coming out of the Trump team, I don't think.
one of my, we're moving on to the sort of campaign now, the election and the campaign. What do you see as the key issues that will, or factors in the election this year? You've mentioned a couple of them already. Are there others?
Yeah, I mean, reflecting, I suppose that observation that I've made a couple of times now about the acute polarisation in American politics. I mean, the answer to the question depends on who you ask. You know, if you look at this overall, you'd say, well, the economy is the biggest issue, followed by healthcare and the Supreme Court nominations, and then you've got COVID and the issue of violent crime rounding out the top five. But if you drill down a bit further, you see clear differences in how registered voters who support Donald Trump and registered voters who support Joe Biden, how they see the importance of these issues. So you go to Trump voters, the economy and violent crime, which is sort of code for BLM, are the most significant issues, followed by immigration and guns, gun policy. Mm-hmm. And for Biden supporters, the foremost issues are healthcare and COVID and racial and ethnic inequality, which is a different way of saying BLM, yep, and the economy. So what you actually have across the political divide, you only really have one area of agreement, and that's that the economy matters a lot. And, you know, people who are in the seminar or in the meeting tonight will probably recall the popular catchphrase that Bill Clinton's campaign strategists made famous during the 1992 campaign. It's the economy's stupid. Well, this year, perhaps more than any other, that matters. You know, due in large part to COVID, due in large part to the botched response to COVID, America really is facing an economic breakdown that would rival or come close to rivaling the Great Depression. And some are calling it the Trump Depression. It's traumatic, whatever way you look at it, and the labour market's going to take a long time to recover.
Michael, in 2018, I think it was, when you spoke to us about the Trump's first 2 years and also reflecting on the 2016 results, one of my Newcastle Institute colleagues noted that you indicated that Trump won the narrative over the Democrats. So it wasn't so much about the data or the evidence that they won the narrative. Despite the data that indicates this time that about the economy and COVID reflecting badly on Trump's performance, do you think Trump's narrative will win again over? And I'm not asking you to predict. Because I got it wrong last time, didn't I?
I shouldn't admit that, but that.
You think it's the narrative that he's trying to push for this election?
Yeah, but he's so far anyway, he's been less successful. So, you know, if we cast our mind back to 2016, and really you could argue up to the start of this year, I mean, almost before COVID, you know, Trump's narrative was basically, I'm going to come in here in my first term, I'm going to drain the swamp, I'm going to build a wall, I'm going to repeal Obamacare, and I'm going to bring back the jobs. I'm going to talk tough on China and all that sort of stuff. And for various reasons that we've talked about in the past, that resonated at the time. You know, an angry electorate that saw Hillary Clinton as a kind of symbol of the establishment or the elites that they sort of reviled as a cultural elite, but also an economic elite. That worked. But when you're running as president, you have to run on your record. And it's very, very difficult to cut through for Trump at the moment because of really the record over the 3.5 years, but particularly the record on COVID, which has not just been a health and life and death catastrophe, but an economic catastrophe. And that's undermined, you know, in a sense, his core message. And his main talking point against the Democratic Party. So I don't think he's winning the narrative, at the moment, Robin.
Yeah. We might move on to Biden now, leave Trump a bit behind. So Joe Biden has selected Kamala Harris as his VP running mate. What do you make of the Biden-Harris ticket for this year's election?
I think it's a bit of a nightmare for Trump, actually. I think he would have preferred to face off against Bernie Sanders or against Elizabeth Warren because it would have been much easier. I mean, he's still running the radical left line in relation to Biden, but I don't know how many people really believe that. So I think, but what Biden and Harris, I think anyway, have done is they've basically reduced the campaign down to how to get rid of Trump, how to beat COVID, and how to restore some semblance of normality, if you like, in American life. So they've, reduced the ideological temperature or the rhetorical temperature. I think their campaign's been up to now fairly professional, fairly effective. I think they are implicitly asking, and I think they should explicitly ask voters this if they haven't already, but I think they're implicitly asking voters whether Trump has passed that election deciding Ronald Reagan test from 1980. Our guest this evening might remember the question that Reagan asked Carter in 1980, and the question was, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is yes, then re-elect the incumbent. If the answer is no, look for a new team. So I think it's been a good campaign. I think they've quite pragmatically sought to focus a lot on what I think it was David Brooks has called the exhausted majority, people who are pretty annoyed at the state of politics and who feel detached from it, people in working class neighbourhoods in the Midwest and in retirement homes in Florida and out in the suburbs. So I think they've gone down the middle, and I think they've done that fairly effectively. Can I illustrate that just with one example about how they're not trying to be particularly ideological? In her debate with Mike Pence, people might recall that Kamala Harris, when they were talking about COVID, she didn't say that government should come in and make the country safe overnight, and she didn't sort of crusade even on the issue of wearing masks. What she did was she said that earlier in the year, Trump denied American families, self-reliant, self-helping American families, the information that they needed to keep themselves safe from COVID. And this is the kind of language that would appeal to, for example, a libertarian who's suspicious of government and suspicious of Washington. Even those people could feel comfortable with that kind of message. So again, pragmatism over ideology, pushing a message of, in a sense, big change, but big change that feels familiar to an anxious electorate. That's been the real driver behind the Biden-Harris ticket, I think, so far.
Yeah. As you said, she's the first black woman, the first South Asian woman to be nominated for a national office by a major political party. How important is her identity? Obviously, her experience is significant, but how important is her identity? And what does a nomination tell us about American society and the Democratic Party?
I think there's obviously a nice symbolic dimension to this, as there was with Obama. But I think far more important really is the fact that Harris, in part due to her identity, not solely, but in part due to her identity as a woman of colour, may inspire more Democrats and particularly more African Americans to get out and vote. And I think that could make a huge difference. So if we track back to 2008 and 2012, Obama's two victories, black turnout was, I think, 65, 67%, around that mark anyway. In Clinton's loss to Trump, it was around about 60%. Now that doesn't sound a lot, but in a super tight election, those figures hurt. So I think if Harris's presence on the ticket can help boost African American turnout to something approaching Obama era levels, and particularly in the battleground states, then Trump's chance of another, electoral college win becomes very, very difficult. In relation to what does her identity and what does her nomination say about the United States and what does it say about the Democratic Party, I think it represents something quite significant about the United States, and this is what some scholars have called the browning of America. So by 2045 or thereabouts, the US is going to be a majority non-white nation. The Democratic Party, with its leaders and with its sort of support bases, has really moved to adapt to the changing demographics of the country. And, the Democratic Party is more diverse, it's more urban, it's more liberal than at any time in its history. The Republicans have kind of moved in the other direction. And though it hasn't hurt the Republicans really up to this point, it does raise some questions about how the party is going to reposition and redefine itself, in the next 20 years or so.
Do you think that the Republican Party will bear a long-term legacy from Trump? A negative legacy, I suppose.
Hard to say. I mean, there are already a large number of prominent Republicans organising to defeat Trump. And through this, some of our listeners tonight might have heard of the Lincoln Project, which is really, well, as they see it anyway, a battle for the soul of the Republican Party. So there's kind of there's a war going on for the soul of conservatism in the United States. And Trump, certainly until this year, certainly until the last few months, has been ascendant in that war. But, presidents come and go. The American system is centuries old. The institutions are under pressure, but nothing if not resilient. And I can almost imagine a situation on the 4th of November, if Trump were to lose, that there wouldn't be many Trumpers in the Republican Party. Now, that then creates, I mean, there are a few now, but there might not be on the 4th of November, but that then creates a headache for the Republican Party because, and for American politics, because there are 40% of the electorate that thinks pretty highly of Trump. And when Trump is gone, there's the very real and very big question about how you respond seriously and openly to the concerns of those people so that they don't feel, if this is your view, that Donald, so that they don't feel that Donald Trump is the only option for them. I think, going back to 2016, Hillary Clinton's description of Trump supporters as the deplorables has to go down as one of the great mistakes. Not only a mistake, it was the wrong thing to do because firstly, it violated the fundamental first rule of politics. Don't attack your opponent's supporters because they could be your supporters. And, if empathy is to mean anything, it has to mean taking seriously people who have different points of view to you and who may not like you very much. And I don't think Hillary did that very well in 2016.
That's a bit of a segue onto the next question, which is about Trump as a racist. He's certainly been labelled as a racist by his critics. And we've seen some really derogatory marks over the years, as well as his support or his implicit support for some of the right-wing extremists. So, and you've also raised the issue of the changing racial demographics with the prediction of, you know, in 20 years' time or so. I'm interested what proportion of Black Americans and also Hispanics may vote for Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. In 2016, it was only 8% of African Americans who voted for Trump, but around 30% of Hispanic Americans voted for Trump, and about the same proportion of Asian Americans actually voted for Trump, about 30%, just under, I think, it's a little under 30%. And what that actually meant is that Trump won a higher proportion or a higher percentage of votes from these groups than did the previous Republican presidential candidate in Mitt Romney in 2012. Now, these statistics kind of surprise people, and you know, the inevitable questions that follow are, well, how could they? And will these groups, you know, will they be a decisive factor in 2020? I think in terms of how could they, I mean, African Americans since the 1960s, they've been the most partisan racial group in the United States. So they have never voted less than 82% for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1964. You know, you say, okay, well, why would some vote for the Republican Party? Well, even though they're politically liberal, they're the most socially conservative demographic in the country. So on issues around abortion and same-sex marriage and school prayer and religiosity, and on some issues around crime, African Americans have views more in line with the Republican Party actually than the Democratic Party. And they tend to subordinate those social concerns to political concerns at the time of federal elections, but not all African Americans do. And so, you know, when they vote for the Republican Party, or indeed when they vote for Trump, who has said some not very nice things about African Americans, what they're really saying is that racial politics is not the key thing driving my voting behaviour here. It's a minority of African Americans, but they're there. Hispanic Americans are a larger group still. They're the largest minority group in the United States. High proportion of Catholics, high proportion of anti-communist Cubans, very religious group. The Republican Party doesn't try to win every Hispanic voter in the country, but it does target very strategically Hispanic voters in the big swing states like Florida and Arizona, which they really need to win the election. So it's fascinating, you know, given the language that Trump uses. I did say to someone though, Robin, the other day, you know, Lyndon Johnson used racially inflammatory rhetoric all the time. Said some appalling things about African Americans, but passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. African Americans vote for him, of course. Now, I'm not comparing Trump to Lyndon Johnson, but I'm saying it is actually possible at a pragmatic level to vote for someone who might say nasty things about your group, but whose policies you deem to be effective for your group. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily, but some people think like that.
You mentioned Florida and Arizona there. Are there any other particular states that are relevant, both in terms of, you know, the racial groups voting for him, or indeed in groups in general?
I think the key state, besides Florida and Arizona, I think Pennsylvania will be a key battleground state. Actually, there are three in the Great Lakes region, Pennsylvania being one, Michigan being the other, and Wisconsin being the third. And then when you move into the Sun Belt, you've got Florida, you've got Arizona, and then you've got North Carolina. So in a sense, these are the 6 key states. And I was talking to my wife about this earlier today, and she was saying, well, why are they the 6 key states? I mean, what's different about these states? And I think they're the key states this time around because they showcase, perhaps more than any other states, the great dividing lines in American politics around race, around education, around, you know, the urban versus rural divide. And some of the key demographics are really going to come into play in these states.
It'll be fascinating to watch on the Wednesday, our time, when it's all happening. The Electoral College is obviously a big thing. We know that Clinton won more votes but didn't win the Electoral College. Can you explain how the Electoral College works? And if we're likely to see a repeat of that issue, more people voting for Democrats but not getting the Electoral College?
I can have a go at it. Look, the first thing to say, I mean, I suppose I'm a political historian, so, you know, I go to history first, and there are 5 presidential candidates who have won the popular vote in American history but lost the election because they didn't get to the magical figure of 270 in the Electoral College. And I won't go through all 5 and tell you about all of them, but I think the 2 most recent ones are significant. I mean, obviously there was Hillary, who actually won nearly 3 million more votes than Trump, but lost the election. There was also Al Gore in 2000, who won more votes than George W. Bush, but lost the election. So how's it possible? Well, when Americans go to the polls, they don't actually vote directly for the president. What they're actually doing is they're telling their electors which candidate they want as president. Now, you say, well, who are the electors? They're party loyalists, or they're individuals who've been close to the campaigns of the respective parties. And they then have their own election in which they select the president and the vice president. I mean, it's sort of a done deal at that point. But if all this sounds too complicated, and if it all sounds a little bit undemocratic, that's because it is. In 2012, even Donald Trump said the Electoral College is a disaster for a democracy, and then he benefited from it. So all in all, there are 538 electors in the Electoral College. You have 1 for each member of the House of Representatives, and you have 2 per senator, and you have 3 allocated in the District of Columbia. So after the voters cast their ballots, what the electors do is they meet in December in their respective states. The blue states, so the Democrat states, give their Electoral College votes to the Democratic candidate, no matter how many Republicans in that state voted for that candidate, and it's vice versa in the red states. And, you know, students used to always say to me, why would you have such a system? I mean, it seems extraordinary, and there aren't many systems that even resemble it. Historically, it was a compromise. It really goes back to the origins of the country, when there was a really great concern that urban centres would dominate in elections to the detriment of sort of the less populated parts of the country. And because the number of electors of a state is tied to the number of representatives, the most populous states have an edge because they wield more power by virtue of having greater representation in the House. But in order to offset that, the founders determined that 2 electors would be allocated per senator, which each state has regardless of size. So the populous states are inherently, the less populous states are inherently given an extra boost. So generally speaking, what you have is Republican support being found in rural areas of the country, while Democratic support is found in the urban areas. The final point I'd make, and I know this is getting long-winded, but is that when you look at a map of nearly any election, what you see is the vast majority of the country painted in red, Republican, no matter the vote. And that is because Republicans dominate in the sparsely populated areas of the United States rather than in the centre of the country. And in the urban areas, see a heavy concentration of Democratic votes. And what this actually does in the end, as it operates today, it means that the Electoral College effectively dilutes the votes of African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans, because they live disproportionately in populous states which have less power in the college per capita. So I think it's unlikely we're going to see a repeat of 2020 because at the moment Biden looks to have the edge. But I wouldn't want to make a prediction.
Michael, there's so many issues to cover, but we haven't really touched much on foreign policy yet. And we haven't got all that much longer to go, but it doesn't seem like that there has been much emphasis on, in either of the campaigns, about foreign policy. What do you see as the major foreign policy issues for the US? And are these issues likely to be on voters' minds when they're making a choice?
Yeah, well, we haven't heard much about foreign policy at all, and that's because foreign policy really determines the outcome of US elections. It's simply too distant from the lives of most Americans, and it's therefore not usually a key talking point for any candidate in any election. There was an exception in 2004, which was the first election after 9/11, of course.
Yep.
But aside from that, there hasn't really been a foreign policy election in any meaningful sense since the end of the Cold War. And we've seen that again this year. I mean, it's not as if there aren't big issues around the place. I mean, the United States is at war. You know, we've got a global pandemic raging. There are powerful enemies or foes who are building up their armies. There's the question of China, the question of Russia. But you know, does this rate high on the issues of major concern for voters? No, it's, you know, foreign policy is usually down in the bottom half of issues. The one thing I would say is it's not unimportant. I mean, in Trump's first term with this American First agenda of his, what we've seen is him trying to basically overhaul the key principles of American foreign policy since the Second World War. So walking away from the world stage, abandoning long-term and trusted allies, weakening America's commitment to free trade, and not speaking up much for principles around democracy and human rights, quite often embracing dictators. So I worry about America's withdrawal, in effect, from the world under Trump, not because I enthusiastically, you know, endorse every US international activity, but I think, you know, I imagine a world without American global leadership. That will be a world not of greater multilateralism where every country sort of symbolically holds hands and sings Kumbaya. It'll be a world where Russia and China move quickly, as they already are, to fill the void or to fill the gap. And I ask myself, is that a better world? And I'm not so sure that it is.
So the October surprise, we've probably had a few already in September as well, but it's a term that's used in US politics to denote an event that may influence the outcome. So, for example, in 2016, it was the reinvestigation into Clinton's emails that was announced in October, and there's been other ones that I won't go into. Do you think that Trump supposedly contracting COVID is this year's October surprise, or do you expect others?
Well, at the moment, not having surprises would be a surprise, I think. There are so many surprises, but certainly that was the big surprise in October. I mean, I can't imagine that, just because COVID is such a big campaign issue for the president, who has been, you know, fairly cavalier, I think it's fair to say, in the way that he's responded to and the way he's talked about COVID. And the fact that he's the most probably protected person in the world, the fact that he contracted COVID and everyone in his inner circle, or close to everyone in his inner circle, contracted COVID, really was, you know, a huge surprise. And it gave Biden and Harris the opportunity to really hone in on what I think is Trump's great weakness in this campaign, because it's not just it's not just a health disaster and a human disaster, it's an economic disaster. And it goes to a question of trust and confidence, whether, you know, the first job of the US president is to keep people in the country safe. And the way we've traditionally thought about that was in terms of foreign policy, you know, national defence. But, you know, keeping people alive during a pandemic is kind of important. And I think, you know, it's a hard thing to do. I mean, I'm not suggesting that, you know, on someone else's watch there would have been no deaths, that there would have been no COVID catastrophe. But what I am suggesting is that responding seriously and maturely to the health advice and to being cautious in the face of the pandemic would have significantly reduced the level of destruction. We haven't seen that with Trump.
Trump has spent a lot of time questioning the legitimacy of the election already, perhaps in preparation. He's intimated that he may not accept the result, even though many of the Republicans said that they will. And he also hasn't committed to a peaceful transfer of power. Are there any provisions in the Constitution or in history for the sitting president to deny the result?
It's unprecedented territory. I mean, it's really uncharted territory for us to be in. And it's, you know, if you have a president that's attacking the institutions of democracy and then going a step further and saying, well, I'm not actually even going to guarantee that I'm going to accept the verdict of the people, and I'm not going to guarantee that I will hand over to my democratic rival in a peaceful manner. You actually got a president who's attacking the fundamentals of the democracy. I think Joe Biden has raised the possibility that in the event that Trump refuses to go, he could send in the military to remove him from the White House. I mean, I don't know. But what I think you'll see Trump doing if the election is tight is, one, raising the question of voter fraud, mainly through the mail and mainly coming out of cities where there are sizable Black and minority populations, so populations that typically support the Democratic Party in high numbers. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is you'll see him try to tie this all up in the Supreme Court, where there is a conservative majority. And that's why, if you're Joe Biden, what you would want to see is a massive victory where you sweep states that you didn't think were possible. You win the popular vote hands down by several million, and you've in the Electoral College you've got a 3 in front of your name, so you've won 300 plus of the 538 Electoral College votes.
Yeah,
there's no ambiguity.
Yeah, so one of the worst outcomes will be if it's a tight result for Biden, tight win for Biden.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Just because, Robin, there is so much uncertainty at the moment about democracy in the United States, and an election result that compounds that feeling, and that compounds the sort of feeling of insecurity during a time of global pandemic, during a time of kind of economic catastrophe, and during a time where there's declining trust in the American system. I mean, it's a recipe for disaster.
I guess sort of a big question to end, Michael, and there's a lot of comparison with the demise of other empires, Roman Empire, with all their current domestic problems. The polarisation that you've talked about throughout tonight, and all the current international issues, particularly with China's increasing assertiveness. Are we witnessing the permanent decline of America, as some analysts have suggested?
maybe the relative decline as China and India and other countries rise. But I mean, this decline narrative is a very old one. It goes back almost to the early days of the Republic, and scholars on the left and scholars of the right are certainly talking now about the crumbling of the empire, you know, likening it to the fall of Rome. But in the 70s, there was a lot of talk during the Carter years about, you know, the end of America as we know it. There were other points during the Cold War where people pronounced the near end of America. I think we have to sort of step back and say, well, what's American power globally built on? What are the foundations? And I think there are three pillars. One has been economic strength. The second has been kind of military strength or military might. And the other has been, or the third has been a kind of soft power that's projected culturally. And, you know, this foundation, this power base, if you like, has taken generations to build. I would be cautious about suggesting that with one president, it will all come falling down. I think what Trump can do, though, and what Trump to some extent has done, is destroy America's allies' faith in the United States. And I think that, combined with the growing power of China, the rising ambition of China and Russia, I think that sort of thing could destabilise the whole world.
Challenging times, Michael, not least of which is that we're all dealing with a pandemic, and hence that you're not here in Newcastle tonight to present like you normally do, but you've taken the time to stay with us on Zoom and present tonight. I understand we've had some problems with Facebook live streaming, but we'll put this video up on Facebook after this. So I just want to, on behalf of all the Newcastle Institute, thank you for participating tonight. Your insight into the American system is invaluable for us because it affects us. I did have someone from America say to me, why are you interested in this? And which, you know, didn't surprise me really, but it's because the decision affects us as well. And because of the ally relationship that we've had for many years. So thank you for joining us tonight. We greatly appreciate it, your insight.
It's my pleasure and really great to be back. And again, thank you for the a very nice honour, which again, I very much appreciate.
And well deserved. So our November event, which we'll send notices about, we wanted to end on a lighter note. It's been a difficult year for everybody, and we've had some tough conversations, starting with the pandemic with public health physicians and intensive care specialists, and some quite challenging issues. So Dr. Carl Kruslinski is joining us in the November event, and his presentation is going to be on his reasons to be happy for the future based on science. So I think that will provide some positivity to end the year. Like most people, the Newcastle Institute has been incredibly agile this year in converting to webinars instead of our live events. And we will do some thinking over the next couple of months, and also ask our members their views about what's going to happen next year. So thank you, and we've had lots of people on the chat to thank you again. Thanks, Michael, and good night to everyone, and stay safe, and we'll see you one more time in November.
All the very best. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. That was great. We'll talk soon.
Yep, thanks.